Now, does anyone have any questions, though, before we move on? Yeah, go ahead.
How would you get a marginal cost curve that was bumpy, if you will?
So I think the best way to think about it is, like, imagine that there were some, like, of these lumpy costs, not fixed costs, but lumpy costs. Then what might happen is, like, if I'm producing, you know, in the intermediate range, I'm basically, like, straining the current factory that I have to its breaking point, and my costs are increasing. But then I, like, buy a new factory, and then it jumps down. Now, that doesn't literally give you a smoothly bumpy one, but it's pretty similar to that.
So those like lumpy costs can be, like, not just after the first unit, but after, like, the 15th unit or something like that?
Exactly. Or you know, it could actually be that you would get a smooth thing like this, because what would happen is that, you know, you would go up to some point and you would be straining the factory, and then at some moment it would be sort of like equally costly to produce the next unit, to like produce all of the first 15 units in the new factory, and just that's when you start breaking even on that, and so you get these like lumpy things like that. Okay, so now the key thing I think that's been missing, or one key thing that's been missing from our discussion so far, is that we talked about costs per unit of time, right? And I think the natural question is, what the heck do we even mean when we talk about the supply function? Because in the end, it's not like firms ever just supply a certain amount. They supply a certain amount every month, or every year, or this particular year. And then they are going to supply a certain amount next year. All production and supply takes place over the course of time, and not at one instant in time, right? And so a natural question is, what the heck do all these models actually correspond to in the real world, right? So a key thing I want to think about for basically the next hour is, how does everything that we've been talking about depend on the duration over which the price stays at a certain level or the firm is producing a certain amount, right? And a key determinant of that is going to be the nature of the goods that the firm is producing. Whether the things that go into making the goods, those factors that we were talking about before, like, you know, academic performance or extracurricular activities, whether those are what I would call intertemporal complements or intertemporal substitutes. Okay, so Sang-hyun, what is an intertemporal complement or a durable good? Can you define that or tell us something about that?
So when the time passes,
yeah,
the value of your product or output just depreciates.
Uh-huh.
And it doesn't really matter how much you use it, it's a matter of time.
Exactly. That's a great description. So it's something that lasts for a non-trivial period of time, but which depreciates with time. And therefore, it doesn't make sense to change it frequently. It's like if I buy a house somewhere, right? I don't want to suddenly vacation somewhere. Imagine I buy a vacation house somewhere. It doesn't make sense for me to suddenly vacation somewhere else the next week, right? Because then I've just like wasted all the money that I spent buying that particular house. And things that are durables are things that are cheap to use during a scarce lifetime. So they're the sorts of things that you would say about them, like it's such a waste that you don't use that thing, right? And we can all think of things in our lives that are like that. Like, you know, I mean, if you had a private jet and you never did anything with it, people would say, you got this private jet, it's such a waste that you don't use it, right? Where you live is like that too. A lot of people say, you know, it's such a waste that you live in Chicago and you have never been to the Museum of the Art Institute, right? Because where you live is something that will last for a short, you know, for a finite period of time, but which is very cheap to use during the time when you live there. But it's going to be very expensive outside of that time frame, right? On the other hand, David Wayne, what are intertemporal substitutes or storables?
It's basically a good that can last for a very long time.
Yeah.
Immediately upon one use or a couple of uses, it kind of loses all of its value.
Yeah, exactly. So it's sort of, the opposite of the case that we were just talking about, right? So a storable is something that lasts for a long time, but can only be used a finite number of times. So it depreciates with use rather than depreciating with time. So it's very cheap to change this thing in the short run. You can consume more of it for a very short period of time, but it's very expensive to consume more of it for a long period of time. And these are things that are expensive to use during a very long life. So what does that mean? You can all think of other objects where you would never say, why don't, it's so wasteful that you don't use that thing. You would say it's so wasteful that you're constantly doing that, right? So like, for example, imagine you had some like store of candy that you really love, right? Or these champagne bottles that we were talking about, and you can't easily get access to more of them. Every time you use one, people would say it's really wasteful that you used it, right? You should keep it for a more valuable occasion, right? So I think a good example of this is vacations. So vacations are the sort of thing where if you have a lot of work or whatever, you can put it off for a few weeks. But in the long term, you're going to go nuts if you don't take a vacation, right? And that's sort of the opposite of like going to the Art Institute here in Chicago, because that's the sort of thing where if you put it off long enough, it's not going to be an option anymore. And there's no reason why you can't do it as often as you want while you're living in that place, right? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just wondering what's the logic behind calling one a compliments and the other substitutes?
Yeah.
Like, where do those names come from?
So compliments means that if I do more of something today, it's more attractive to do more of it tomorrow. A substitute is that if I do more of something today, it's less attractive to do it tomorrow. So in a house, living in Chicago today and living in Chicago tomorrow are highly complementary with one another. Otherwise, I'd have to be moving all of my stuff every day, right? On the other hand, going on a vacation today is substitutable with going on a vacation tomorrow, because at the end of a vacation, you're pretty bored usually, right? And at the end of many months of work, you're like desperately in need of a vacation, right? Okay. So all of this stuff depends on context, but typically, let me give you some examples of what we usually think are storable and durable commodities. So some very durable things are entry by firms into industries or the education you have. It's very hard to be like a great physicist today and tomorrow a terrible physicist and a great economist, right? Those aren't things that you can change very easily over the course of a few days, right? Probably the most durable things that we talk about in economics are cultural, political, economic, and social institutions. So usually what people mean when they say institutions is the same thing that they mean when they say a policy, except that it lasts for a longer time, right? So there's been a lot of work in economics about how institutions that were set up in various societies have lasted just like enormous amounts of time. Like, the Spanish came into Peru and they built all these things to just like take money out of the mines, and the Peruvian state is still sort of predatory on people 500 years later as a result of that. I don't know if anyone's ever read Acemoglu and Robinson's book about that. It's very hard for a country to be Catholic one day or even one year and Protestant the next year. Those are things that change very infrequently and are very costly to change, right? So somewhat durable commodities are machines, job experience. Job experience is something that is not quite like an education. It's something you forget more easily, you learn more easily, right? Physical plants. Again, those are hard to change, but maybe not quite as hard to change as entering an industry as a whole. Another example would be production procedures or personal relationships that you have with people, right? Or memories that you have. So those maybe fade more slowly than something like your education that you spent so long learning, but they also endure for a while. Variable things are things which are neither durable nor storable. So unskilled labor, even bulky raw materials. So even if you buy them in bulk, you can still, they don't last that long necessarily, right? The effect that advertising has on people's desire to purchase your product is thought by many to be quite variable. That is, you can advertise to someone today, and they often forget about the effects of that advertising later. So you constantly have to be doing it again if you want to keep them buying your product. Somewhat storable things are inventories of goods. So when a company says it has an inventory, that means that it's got some sort of stockpile and it can use it now, but if it uses it now, then it can't use it later. It's more costly for them to go and produce more stuff. Favors are also somewhat storable, right? So like if you did a favor for someone and they owe you a favor back, it's somewhat storable. At some point, they'll probably forget they owe you a favor, so you better not wait too long. But on the other hand, you can't like ask them for a bunch of favors. In the interim, you can probably only ask them for one favor, so it's worth storing it for a while until you have a good use. Discontinued consumer goods are another example of this. So I don't know if anyone saw the Seinfeld episode about the sponges, but that's sort of a classic example of this. I won't go into too much detail about that to avoid scandalizing you guys, but you can look it up on the internet. Very storable goods are, for the economy as a whole, oil, gas, copper. These are things that there's sort of like a finite amount out there of, and once you use it, it's gone. And for an individual, money is a storable good. It's probably the most storable good, right? Great bottles of wine are another example. They actually get better with time. Okay, so why does all of this matter? David Wang? Why do we care whether things are intertemporal substitutes or complements?
I think whether the nature of the good kind of affects their use and how the markets value them.
Mm-hmm.
For example, storables. Yes.
Yeah.
Like oil.
Yeah.
Markets will likely prevent try not to drill as much.
Uh-huh.
Like the demand won't be will always be really high for them.
Uh-huh.
Because as soon as you drill for it and as soon as you use it, it will be gone.
Uh-huh.
So kind of want to keep that there. And whereas durables, people would treat them a little bit more differently.
Yeah, so it affects the intertemporal structure of the supply. So in particular, the more things you can adjust in a given time frame, the more elastic your response is going to be. So let me give you an example of that. And it doesn't have to matter whether the good is a complement or a substitute for the good that you're considering. In either case, what really matters is whether it's an intertemporal complement or substitute, whether it's storable or durable. So for example, imagine that the price of gasoline were to rise. Now in the short term, what would you do? You would probably stop driving quite as much. You'd try to not go on a vacation or something like that. But you probably wouldn't buy a new car or something like that if it was only rising for a short period. But on the other hand, if you know the price of gasoline is rising for a long period, then it might make sense to buy a car, right? And so because there's a durable, the car, which is substitutable for having a lot of gasoline, right? And that is a durable, you don't want to adjust that very frequently. And so the longer that the shock occurs for, the more that you're going to adjust your purchases of gasoline, right? Because once you buy that car, you're going to be consuming a lot less gasoline. Whereas when you were just taking fewer trips, you were only consuming a little bit less gasoline, right? So the more that you can adjust things, the more that there will be an effect. But things could go in the other direction, even with the case of the gasoline, right? Imagine that the price of gasoline went up for 1 week during the summer, and you knew it would be gone the next week, right? Well, then you wouldn't take your vacation this week. You would take your vacation next week, right? So in that case, you can actually adjust more things in the short run than you can in the long run. Because if you knew the price went up for the whole summer, you probably would still take your vacation, right?